Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. My name is Luqmanul Hakeem. I am a lecturer at Darul Islamic University. Today's presentation topic is topology of interpretation, usul fiqh and Ghazalian hermeneutics in consideration. This presentation primarily focused on the primary text of Al-Ghazali, Imam Al-Ghazali, Faisal al-Tafriqa, and Al-Mustasfa min Ilm al-Usul. How Al-Ghazali interprets the text and what are the levels of interpretation, the topology of interpretation, just like that. According to Al-Ghazali, there are three types of meaningful utterance. Al-Lafzul Mufid, an utterance which is precise and unambiguous, allowing no conflict of alternative possible meanings. This is called as explicit denotation. Secondly, an utterance whose meaning is broad in scope, allowing more than one possible meaning, none of which, however, has preponderance over other, tarjih over another. This is called mujmal, general, and mubham, ambiguous. Thirdly, an utterance which has more than one meaning, but where there is at first stage preponderance of one meaning over another. The preponderant meaning is called zahir, apparent meaning. The less obvious, well interpreted meaning, we call it interpretation or well. Sometimes Al-Ghazali maintains a less obvious possible meaning is chosen instead of apparent one when there is evidential proof that gives the former preponderance over the latter. The process of choosing a less evident but possible meaning as against a more evident one in most cases as against another possible but less evident meanings is called ta'wil, interpretation. Al-Ghazali suggests that there are three kinds of evidence for interpretation of a text. The evidence for interpretation Al-Ghazali holds that may be circumstantial, contextual meaning, or analogical deduction, qiyas, or another text whose apparent meaning supports the interpretation in question. However, it is notable that in Faisal al-Tafriqa, which is translated by Sherman A. Jackson on the tolerance of theological interpretation, Al-Ghazali initially divides existence into 5 different degrees, all of which he claims, Al-Ghazali claims to be unanimously recognized by all Muslim schools of thought. He says, he claims in Faisal al-Tafriqa. The first degree, the first layer of interpretation, first level of existence, Al-Ghazali maintains that the highest degree of existence is essential existence, al-wujud dhati. It is real existence you observe, stands outside of sense and intellect, but both sense and intellect receive an image from it. Such an example of existence is Arsh, the divine throne of God, and the 7 heavens about which the Prophet has given us information. These expressions, Ghazali observes, signify really existing bodies regardless of whether or not they can be perceived by sense or imagination. Therefore, such words should not be interpreted in any way whatsoever. They should be accepted in their apparent meaning, in their zahir meaning. The second layer of existence, Al-Ghazali said that the sensible existence, al-wujud al-hissi, is the next degree. This kind of existence, he explains, represents itself in visual faculty of the eye, but does not exist outside the eye. Thus, it is peculiar to only the person who senses it. An example of that is what a person sees in a dream or a daydream. It is peculiar to that person who dreams. The third degree of existence is imaginative existence, al-wujud al-khayali. This type of existence is the image of sensible objects one creates in its own mind, while those objects are absent from sensation. It is only in its imaginative power. The fourth level of existence is mental existence, al-wujud al-aqli. This occurs Al-Ghazali holds that when something has a soul, or an objective reality, haqiqa, and a meaning, maina, but the intellect acquires only its meaning without its image being present in the imagination or senses or exertion at all. For example, Hans has both a sensible and imaginative image, and it also a meaning that stands for its essence. That meaning is the ability to strike uh, uh, kuwa kudratul alal bast. In philosophy, we call it kudratul kuwa kudra bil fail. The kudratul kuwa, which has the power to exert the striking. The ability to strike then is an intellectual hand. Al-Ghazali holds that there is an external mental source of all beings. The last degree of existence, in Ghazali's opinion, is what he calls analogical existence, al-wujud al-shabahi al-majazi, or we can call it figurative interpretation. And according to his definition, this kind of existence deals with anything whose image and objective reality are not present in senses, the imagination, the intellect, or external at all. But what is seen or felt in any one of these is something else which resembles in it one of its qualities or characteristics. We compare it or figuratively compare it in one of its qualities or characteristics. Al-Ghazali believes that first of these 5 degrees is not an interpretation. The first one of literal existence, it is the real meaning and therefore the real existence. On the other hand, he believes that the rest of degrees necessitate interpretation whose strength correspond to with the descending order of the uh, kind of the existence which it belongs. To Imam Al-Ghazali, the degrees of textual interpretation are parallel in number and in kind. With his degrees of existence, he maintains thus when an existence mentioned in a revelation, Quran or Hadith, is real, that is essential, should not be interpreted. Instead, it must be retained with its apparent meaning. Then Al-Azali goes to cite of example for more which of the remaining 4 degrees of existence and as applied to interpretation. He notes that there are several examples in Revelation for sensible existence. One such existence is one mentioned the tradition in Hadith, which says that the famous tradition of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, on the day of resurrection, Yom Qiyamah, death will be brought to the presence of mankind in the form of a black and white ram, white coat. Then it will be slaughtered in a place between paradise and hell. We can assume that Al-Ghazali points out that those scholars who abuse the proof that death is an accident and therefore cannot be possibly transformed into a substance, which is the ram in this case, interrupt the tradition to mean that on the days of resurrection, people will see the ram, believe it to be death. This is eventually lead them to feel certainly secure from death after it has been slaughtered. But in reality, the ram and slaughter exist only in their senses, not outside of. The existence in their tradition, the hadith, is thereby interpreted as sensible existence. The ram is only sensible to those who sees or feels it. Nonetheless, those who have evidence of impossibility of transformation of accident in the substance believe that death is itself will be actually transformed to ram on the days of resurrection and then be slaughtered. But of course, this would mean an initiative existence because it is not an interpretation, but it's the meaning of the text. For the imaginative existence, Al-Ghazali quotes an example of the tradition that I on the I were looking at you and at Yunus, Jonah, the son of Matthew, clothed in two dresses, making the talbiya and being replied it by my winds. On the Miraj, the supplication of to the God, he saw many prophets. We can assume that Al-Ghazali holds that this tradition informs that about the existence of that figure in the prophet's imagination. Also, the very image had existed in the past, even before the Prophet's lifetime. It was no longer existing at the time he uttered the tradition in question. Al-Ghazali says that the word, it seems I emphasizes that the fact that the narration was not real but an imaginary experience. Al-Ghazali then gives two examples of tradition for mental assistance. The first one of it is, whoever is taken out of hellfire shall be given as his portion of paradise 10 times equivalent of this world. Whoever takes from hell shall be given 10 times of equivalent of this world in the paradise in Jannah. Al-Ghazali observes that the apparent meaning of the above tradition signifies that the position of which will be given in paradise is going to be 10 times of the equivalent of this world inside the earth, this world. Thus, this would definitely represent both sensible and imaginary disparity. But one would find it difficult to reconcile this notion of with what the revelation apparently indicates, namely the paradise is in heaven. How then, Al-Ghazali, there is a difference. There is a heaven and there is a paradise, the Adin, the paradise. So, how then Al-Ghazali asks, can heaven be broad enough to contain 10 times of the equivalent of the world when heaven also is part of it? Heaven uh, is part of the paradise. How it can contain 10 times of its own existence? The only way to avoid this question is be effectively raised to interpret the tradition to mean abstract and mental disparity and not sensible and imaginative. As for the analogical reason interpretation, Al-Ghazali mentions the anger, craving, joy, and patience, and such attributes of God mentioned in Revelation in Quran and Hadith. The anger of God, the joy, the patience of God, such like that. Anger, for example, Imam Al-Ghazali insisted that is a ebullition of one's hurt blood because of the desire to gratify one's taste for revenge. Uh, uh, Anger means there is a desire to the desire and thirst for a revenge. But this is imperfection and pain inherent in this attitude. But the scholars who abuse prove that this very anger, because of its inherent imperfection, cannot be attributed to God as an essential, sensible, imaginative, or mental attribute, and should be interpreted to mean another attribute that has or the characteristics of anger, that the will to punish. The anger of God should be interpreted as the will to punish. Al-Ghazali then said that whoever confirms any of the texts of the Revelation to fall one of the 5 degrees of existence is a believer. There is a Faisal Africa is which is known as the decision distinction decisive criterion between one who is a believer and a non-believer. So he categorized this concept of for 5 level of existence and said that whenever one hadith or one revelation should be interpreted to this according to these levels, should shall be considered as a believer. And however, he has said equally that to reject all of these degrees interpretation with regard to any revealed text under any pretext or whatsoever is outright disbelief and atheism. If one should negate the, if one negate the all 5 existence or interpretative schema should be considered should be considered in disbelief and atheist. There are something more to this kind of interpretation, this layer of existence. He follows that one should not attempt to interpret a text, reduce its meanings to a degree less than the of the essential meaning, unless there is a apodictic proof of the impossibility of the apparent essential meaning. One should stick to apparent explicit meaning of the text, and uh, should not should not go to another level, the lower levels of existence. If the in interpretation, one must start with the highest degree, sensible interpretation. After the real existence, real meaning, one should start with the interpretation with the sensible interpretation. then one should turn to next degree, imaginative interpretation. Should not after that turn to the degree next to unless one finds the second category to be an impossible interpretation and so forth. It is noteworthy that Al-Ghazali said that each of the higher degrees of the interpretation automatically contains the meaning of the degree below it, which means that another point should be needs to be clarified that Ghazali doesn't deny the possibility of multiple interpretation. Whatever tier a particular reading occupies, the reading below it could provide an additional interpretation. As long as the most authoritative reading of based on the highest level is in jeopardize, this additional reading can yield an other interpretation that may further help appreciate scripture. An example he gives that consider the incident of Moses, the prophet Moses, Musa, when God spoke to him. There is a verse in the Quran where God commands him to take off his sandals. In this verse, Allah commands him to take off his sandals. That was he is wearing at that time. Sufis could interrupt. Sufis could interrupt this in a mystical term. For instance, the sandals could be understood as symbols of this world and the hereafter. And Prophet Moses, was instructed to leave both behind to give himself fully to God. These are, of course, speculative, which Al Ghazali acknowledges, but this interpretation of these two sandals as this world and hereafter, this interpretation is still perfectly compatible with the apparent meaning of the verse. So there is no harm. It is why we Al Ghazali being lenient with Sufi interpretation. So as long as they are in the boundaries of outlined earlier, to be interpret as this world and hereafter, one should accept that there is a two sandals and God commands him to take it off. There are further going on in rational matters to be interpreted in rational matters. Only in the explicit penetration free from any possibility of uncertainty is acceptable. A strong or a weak sense of uncertainty are both equal for simple reason that a rational indicant does not tolerate any contradiction. To interpret a rational matter, there is no certainty is allowed. There is the strength of the indicant would to larger extent to be determine the degree of uncertainty. It is therefore compulsory for jurists or theologians to direct their attention to those elements which would generate strongest possibility of some certainty or uncertainty. It's true that every hermeneutical interpretation is not acceptable purely on the strength of an arbitrary indicandent. Since people will differ as to whether an indicandent is strong or weak, says Al Ghazali. So, to interpret a rational matter, there should be a clear, uncertain verse or uncertain matter to interpret those texts, those revelation. In case of textile uncertainty accompanied by several uh, contextual indicators, Karain, only the corrective force of these contextual indicators is capable of being ending a particular interpretive uncertainty. Singular or isolated Karain, single context or single contextual indicator on their own not of sufficient strength to eliminate any uncertainty. There should be sufficient or strength to eliminate any figure, any interpret, any apparent meaning of the text. An example of this is interpretation of two statements of Prophet. One was addressed to the case Al-Ghazali exemplify this in Al-Mustasfa min al-Musul. The case of marriage, one was addressed to Ghailan, a companion who embraced Islam, having at the having 10 wives at that time. The Prophet said, "Take four and leave others." In the other statement, he ordered Fairuz Telemi, who accepted Islam while married to two sisters, a marriage forbidden in Islam, he was married to two sisters simultaneously at the same time. So the Prophet said to him, take one sister and leave the other. The Kufan jurist Abu Hanifa, Abu Hanifa, the Imam of Hanafi school of thought, interpreted this statement to mean a performative or command to initiate marriage. He has to initiate for marriage to initiate marriage in nikah and so on. Okay, there are many kinds of examples he exemplifies in Al-Mustasfa min al-Usul to whether how to interpret and how he critiques both Imam Abu Hanifa, his own jurist Imam Shafi, and there are many more examples. He considers what is an correct interpretation, what is the how to preserve the apparent meaning. Here I conclude. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.